Hello, and welcome to Oklahoma City University via webinar. My name is Martha Berger, and I'm the president of OCU. I want to give special thanks to the Neustadt family for their gift of endowed lectureship to the Wimberley School of Religion. Walter and Dolores Neustadt of Ardmore, Oklahoma, established the lecture series in 1983 to help us strengthen our understanding of the great contributions of the Judaic religious tradition to Western civilization and thought. Scholars are invited to campus to speak on a range of informative themes in the area of Hebrew scripture, Judaic thought, and Jewish ethics and art. Once again, thank you for your attendance. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa Wolf to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Berger. We're so glad you're with us today. I'm Dr. Lisa Wolf, professor of Hebrew Bible at Wimberley School of Religion at Oklahoma City University. And this afternoon, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Rosenfeld as our 2021 Neustadt lecturer. Dr. Alvin H. Rosenfeld is professor of English and Jewish Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. He has taught at Indiana University since 1968, after receiving his PhD from Brown University. He holds the Irving M. Glazer Chair in Jewish Studies and is director of the university's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He founded Indiana University's well-regarded Bourne's Jewish Studies program and served as its director for 30 years. Professor Rosenfeld has served as an editorial board member of various scholarly journals, including Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Anti-Semitism Studies. He's also been a board member and scholarly consultant to various Jewish institutions and organizations, including the Koret Foundation and the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany. He held a 5-year presidential appointment on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council from 2002 to 2007, and also served on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Executive Committee. For 10 years, he was chair of the academic committee of the museum's Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. He continues his service as a member of that committee, as well as the museum's Committee on Contemporary Antisemitism. Some of his publications include the 2011 book, The End of the Holocaust, and Deciphering the New Antisemitism from 2015. He is also editor of a series of books on Jewish literature and culture published by Indiana University Press, as well as editor of IUP's book series, Studies in Antisemitism. Coming in November of this year will be his edited collection entitled Contending with Anti-Semitism in a Rapidly Changing Political Climate. For these and all of Dr. Rosenfeld's other titles with Indiana University Press, the publishing house has extended a generous offer of 30% off to all webinar participants. You just need to use the discount code Rosenfeld, which I will also provide to you in the chat feature later during the lecture. Dr. Rosenfeld has been honored with Indiana University's Distinguished Service Award, Provost's Medal, and President's Medal, which is Indiana University's highest award, in recognition of scholarly accomplishment, service, and leadership. We are so pleased to welcome Dr. Rosenfeld this afternoon to our second of 3 2021 Neustadt lectures. This lecture is entitled History of Anti-Semitism and its Culmination in the Nazi Genocide of the Jews During World War II. We are honored to have you with us, Dr. Rosenfeld. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf, and thank you, President Berger. It's a real privilege to offer these lectures. I'm grateful to have the chance to speak with all of you. The first one yesterday was followed by a very interesting and I thought productive question and answer session, and I look forward to something similar following my talk with you today. Anti-Semitism has been called the longest hatred. It dates back over many centuries and has manifested itself in a variety of harmful, even often lethal ways. In my time with you today, I will sketch in some of the salient features of this history and then look in particular at its culmination in the Nazi persecution and mass murder of the Jews during World War II. First, though, as I did yesterday, because some of you will be new today, it will be important to define anti-Semitism in a way we can think about in common. Simply put, we might think of anti-Semitism as hostility to Jews based on an irrational and exaggerated fear of Jews, resentment of Jews, suspicion of Jews, distrust of Jews, hatred of Jews, etc. While such hostility has been a threatening presence in numerous countries at various times, what drives it is not always the same, nor are the forms it takes always alike. For our purposes, it will be helpful to note at least two significant versions. In a recently published book, which I highly recommend, entitled Blaming the Jews, Politics and Delusion, the British philosopher Bernard Harrison distinguishes between what he calls social anti-Semitism and political anti-Semitism. Social anti-Semitism is driven by contempt or extreme dislike of Jews. Its goal is social exclusion, the marginalization of people deemed to be unlikable, disagreeable, disgusting, etc. When Jews are viewed in this way, the impulse is to keep at a distance from them, ostracize them, or cast them out. Hence the efforts over many years to segregate or exclude Jews from certain neighborhoods, lines of work, social circles, schools and universities, hospitals, and the like. In its most extreme expressions, the proponents of social anti-Semitism seek to banish Jews from the countries where they reside or ghettoize them within restricted areas. One result was the forced exile of Jews from England and Spain in the Middle Ages and the establishment of Jewish ghettos in Venice and other Italian cities. Political anti-Semitism, by contrast, is driven far more by fear than contempt and has different, more destructive goals. Those possessed by such feelings regard Jews as a threat to their very well-being and to the general health and stability of society. They believe that Jews are conspiratorially organized to seize power through their penetration and control of major political and cultural institutions, financial markets, the media, and other areas of government and civil society. In pursuit of these aims, Jews are allegedly responsible for human suffering on such a large scale as to be agents of evil. Thought to be aligned with Satan or the devil, they are bent on carrying out demonic deeds on a cosmic scale. Hitler thought of Jews in these terms. He referred to them in Mein Kampf as veritable devils, his phrase. As he put it, their activities, if left unchecked, and I quote him, must ultimately result in the collapse of human civilization and the consequent devastation of the world. To those who think about Jews in these apocalyptic, phantasmagorical terms, the goal is not the social exclusion of the Jews, but their total elimination. Given the magnitude of Jewish wickedness as it's so conceived, simply to avoid Jews or keep them at arm's length is not enough. They need to be destroyed. If what I have just put before you sounds extreme, it is. Unfortunately, it's borne out by a past replete with examples of anti-Jewish exclusion, expulsion, exile, persecution, mass violence, and in the mid-20th century in Europe, acts of genocide that took the lives of millions of innocent people. I'll say some more about this last crime a bit further on. For now, I'll briefly highlight some of the most destabilizing and destructive forms that anti-Semitism has taken in earlier centuries. The pagan world was not free of anti-Jewish persecution, but it rarely reached the severity of Jew hatred in subsequent centuries in Europe. Resentment of Jewish success in Alexandria, where at one time Jews made up some 40% of the city's population, resulted in a large pogrom in the year 38 of the Common Era. Jews living in Rome in the late first century were also targeted for mass violence. Behind these outbreaks was social, cultural, and political antagonism to Jews, rooted often in economic resentments of Jewish commercial success and what was seen to be competition for the interest and loyalty of Greek and Roman citizens. Judaism as a monotheistic faith, with its own religious laws, customs, and observances, and a strong ethical tradition, both repelled and attracted non-Jews of the time. Some were drawn to it and even converted. Others, such as the Latin authors Seneca, Quintilian, Juvenal, and Tacitus, wrote disparagingly of Jews and Judaism and encouraged people to keep at a distance from both. The pervasive religious, racial, and ideological underpinnings of Jew hatred in European countries in later centuries, however, does not seem to have had a counterpart in the pagan world. One result is that Jews in the Greco-Roman world prospered at times and came to number some 10 million people at the start of the Christian era. The rise and spread of Christianity mark a decisive turning point in the history of anti-Semitism. This is a long and complex story, and I cannot begin to do it justice in my address to you today. At its root are social, cultural, economic, and religious factors that at times have resulted in discrimination, persecution, and mass violence against Jews. From its earliest beginnings, Christianity, an outgrowth of Judaism, saw itself in competition with its forerunner in faith, and on theological grounds separated itself from Judaism. As early as the Apostle Paul, the new faith embraced a theology according to which belief in the divinity of Jesus superseded and replaced Judaism. It deemed itself the new Israel, a triumphant successor to the Israel of old. This too has a long and complex history and warrants a semester-long course. I wouldn't be surprised if one is given at your university, and not just a single lecture. For our purposes, I'll emphasize two long-standing and often passionately held Christian accusations against the Jews. They go to the very heart of Christian-Jewish tensions over the ages, and they have resulted in no end of disputation and destruction. The first is Jews are blamed for the most horrendous of crimes imaginable, deicide, the murder of God himself. And second, through their stubborn refusal to recognize the claims of the Gospels, Jews stand outside of the circle of salvation, and by doing so, they call into question Christianity's claims to absolute truth. In our own day, and especially since knowledge of the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews became widespread, a number of churches have sought to re-examine their teachings about Judaism and the Jews, and to introduce changes that might bring about better interfaith relations. Some notable progress has been made. But the two charges I've just called to your attention were widely adopted by the church fathers of medieval Christianity, and for centuries defined Christian teachings and preaching about Judaism and the Jews. This too has a variegated history and includes periods of relative harmony within European countries. And yet the citation of such New Testament passages as Matthew 27:24, his blood be on us and on our children, and Revelation 2:9, which refers to the synagogue of Satan, has long been a defining feature of Christian views and has done irreparable harm. The history of Christian attitudes to Judaism and the Jews, therefore, has often been a bloody one. As early as the 4th century of the Common Era, synagogues were burned in Rome and other parts of Italy, in Antioch, and in North Africa. In the 7th century, Jews in Spain were given the choice of baptism or exile. Forced conversion in Spain was common, and Jewish children of a very young age were to be raised as Christians. With the First Crusade in the year 1096, Jews in Germany and France were murdered by the thousands. On reaching Jerusalem, the Crusaders set fire to the main synagogue in that city, burning alive all of the Jews inside. The Second Crusade also targeted and killed large numbers of Jews. Church laws in the 12th century reduced Jews to the condition of servitude and forced them to wear clothing with special symbols that marked them out for scorn. In addition to bearing the accusation of deicide, Jews were often stigmatized for allegedly desecrating the Christian host, for poisoning wells, bringing on disease, especially at the time of the Black Death, of acts of ritual murder, including preposterously killing Christian children and using their blood for the preparation of matzah, the unleavened wafer eaten during the holiday of Passover, and overall for being agents of Satan. There was no basis, in fact, for any of these wild charges, and yet they became part of popular folklore in a number of European countries and were accepted as true. What followed this steady demonization of the Jews was predictable. In the late 14th century, for instance, some 50,000 Spanish Jews were slaughtered, and many more were forcibly baptized. Similar events took place elsewhere. A voluminous anti-Semitic literature, accompanied and often provoked these attacks. I'll mention just one of these works, Martin Luther's Concerning the Jews and Their Lies from the year 1543. In it, Luther, who first sought to convert the Jews and was disappointed when he failed to do so, explicitly called for the burning of Jewish synagogues, for the destruction of Jewish homes, for the abolishment of Jewish prayer books and the Talmud, for the silencing of rabbis, and for the seizing of all Jewish wealth and other valuable possessions. In this same tract, Luther proclaimed, and I quote his words, "Let us drive them out of the country for all time, away with them." What I've just given you is only a small peek into a long and often perilous history. It includes periods of tolerance and relative social harmony, but these times were often interrupted by the denigration, demonization, and uprooting of Jewish communal life, as well as savage assaults on large numbers of Jews. The advent of the European Enlightenment in the late 17th century and 18th century seems promising, for among other advances, it saw a decline of religious prejudice. The age of reason was not always reasonable, however, and in some of its most prominent thinkers, one continues to find disparaging attitudes towards Judaism and the Jews. In French thought, Voltaire, who was against religions on the whole and probably hated the church more than he did the synagogue, thought of the Jews and wrote about the Jews as barbarous and fanatical, his words. In Germany, Kant looked forward to what he called the euthanasia of Judaism, a direct quote from Kant. Hegel considered Judaism valid in its formative period, but later obsolete. And Fichte wrote that the only way to emancipate the Jews and give them civil rights, and I quote Fichte, would be to cut off their heads in one night and put other heads on them in which there would not be a single Jewish idea. All of that quoted. These writers and many others like them exemplify the development in the modern period of a secular intellectual anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. It takes an ominous turn in Europe in the 19th century with the rise of what came to be called scientific racism, which resulted in an escalation of discrimination against Jews. Scientific racism posited the existence of superior and inferior peoples. It held that biological differences between races were ingrained and affected the moral character as well as the physical and mental characteristics of people. The negative stereotypes commonly attributed to Jews, therefore, were taken to be racially determined, unchanging, and inherent features of who the Jews essentially were, a fact that nothing could alter. Baptizing Jews, therefore, would be futile, and so would be trying to enlighten them through education. Integrating Jews or assimilating Jews, which was expected to be part of their civil emancipation, simply would not work. The Jew was by nature who he was, forever destined to be an inferior, unalterable, and threatening presence. Thus, the only way to contend effectively with the allegedly pernicious Jewish influence was to eliminate the Jews by whatever means deemed necessary. It fell to Hitler and his allies to come up with these means at their most extreme, which they euphemistically called the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. Since, in their view, on racial grounds, Jews could never be authentic Germans, emancipating them by giving them equal rights had been a mistake. The solution was to de-emancipate the Jews through the passage of increasingly restrictive racial laws. These laws turned the Jews into a pariah people, one to be looked down upon and shunned, and ultimately led to their oppression, persecution, and mass destruction. Here is how Raoul Hilberg, one of the leading scholars of the Holocaust, has described this process. I quote Hilberg: "The missionaries of Christianity had said, in effect, 'You have no right to live among us as Jews.' The secular rulers who followed proclaimed, 'You have no right to live among us.' The German Nazis at last decreed, 'You have no right to live.' These progressively more drastic goals brought in their wake a slow and steady growth of anti-Jewish action and anti-Jewish thinking. The process began with the attempt to drive the Jews into Christianity. The development continued in order to force the Jews into exile. It was finished when the Jews were driven to their deaths." All of that quoted from Hilberg. Multiply these deaths by some 6 million, and we arrive at events so extreme that the Italian Jewish writer Primo Levi calls them collectively the greatest crime in the history of humanity. This crime, which Levi knew firsthand as a Jewish prisoner of Auschwitz, cannot be fully explained by anti-Semitism alone, for other factors contributed to it as well. And yet Auschwitz, the largest single murder site in history, and countless other camps, ghettos, and killing fields, would be inconceivable without the motivating factor of a pervasive and unrestrained hatred of the Jews. It's been with us for many centuries and was brought to a level of unparalleled violence by Hitler and his allies. With them, Jew hatred became so radically eliminationist as to become genocidal. In the post-war years, the furies that fuel anti-Semitism quieted for a time, but they've revived in our own day on a global scale and are making themselves felt in our own country, as I pointed out in my talk yesterday. The question before us, therefore, is what can we do to see that such hatred not bring on still greater harm? Minimally, learn of the atrocious experiences that writers like Levi, Elie Wiesel, Imre Kertész, and countless others recounted, and take to heart their words of testimony, witness, and warning. All of these writers knew Nazi terror firsthand and have given us invaluable accounts of its devastating cost to millions of innocent people. Following their liberation from Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and other camps, they felt obliged to testify about the Nazi slaughter, which Levy called the central event of the 20th century. Their motives for writing might be summed up by these words of Elie Wiesel, taken from the preface to his first book, Night, and I now quote him. "Without this testimony, my life as a writer, or my life period, would not have become what it is, that of a witness who believes he has a moral obligation to try to prevent the enemy from enjoying one last victory by allowing his crimes to be erased from human memory. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. To forget would be not only dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." All of that quoted from Wiesel. To keep the dead from being forgotten, this author devoted most of his life in the post-war period to writing about the war, and I quote him once again, that Hitler and his accomplices waged not only against Jewish men, women, and children, but also against Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and therefore Jewish memory. In book after book, Primo Levi did the same, warning in the last chapter of his last book that as memory fades and becomes distant and blurred, and now I quote him, "What happens can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." The writer Imre Kertész, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, concurs, writing late in his life, and I quote Kertész, that the anti-Semite of our age no longer just loathes Jews, he wants Auschwitz. And he continues, Auschwitz in fact occurred, and what once was can occur again. These are ominous words, and versions of them appear in the writings of these authors and many others. They link the future fate of humankind itself to the fate of Holocaust memory. To remain alive, memory depends on knowledge of the past. And with respect to this past, sources of knowledge are not lacking. In fact, the Nazi persecution and mass murder of the Jews may well be the most copiously documented crime in history. If we ask, though, what people today actually know about the Holocaust, the results can be disheartening. For instance, in September of last year, the Claims Conference, an agency in New York City, issued a report on Holocaust awareness among Americans. Among their findings, 63% of all Americans queried do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered. 36% of respondents thought that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Additionally, although there were more than 40,000 camps and ghettos in Nazi-occupied Europe, 48% of national survey respondents cannot name a single Nazi camp or ghetto. That's almost one out of every two. In addition, and this came as a real shocker for me to learn, 15% of Americans who responded believe that it's acceptable today to hold neo-Nazi views. 11% of respondents believe that Jews actually caused the Holocaust, and nearly 20% of people in the millennial and Gen Z generation feel that Jews caused the Holocaust. Also especially troublesome is that 23% of respondents believe the Holocaust happened, but the number of Jews who died, they believe, is greatly exaggerated or is a myth and did not happen, or are just unsure. These are awfully discouraging findings, and they're made still worse by the results of another study, this one published by the American Jewish Committee more recently, called The State of Anti-Semitism Knowledge in America. The report tells us that nearly half of Americans are unfamiliar with the term anti-Semitism. A quarter of respondents say that they've heard the term, but they're not sure what it means. And fully a fifth of them, 21%, say they've never heard the term anti-Semitism before. And all of this at a time when anti-Jewish hostility in both word and deed has become resurgent globally and has a presence in our own country. So how can we best respond to this sorry state of affairs? The philosopher Emil Fackenheim, a German Jew who himself was incarcerated in one of Hitler's camps, added an additional commandment to the mitzvot or commandments that faithful Jews are expected to observe. And these are Fackenheim's words. Thou shalt not hand Hitler any posthumous victories. I'll repeat it. Thou shalt not hand Hitler any posthumous victories. One way to keep Hitler from prevailing is to keep alive the memory of the millions who simply by right of being born as Jews were subjected to unfathomable anguish, cruelty, degradation, and destruction under Nazi rule. For reasons that are deeply moral as well as historical, therefore, we owe a debt to the dead, the least of which is to remember them and then to do whatever we can to see that others not share their fate in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld, for your words and your education for us this afternoon. At this point, we're going to start a time of question and answer. And to begin that, I've invited several panelists to join us. And after I introduce them and give them a while to discuss and ask their own questions, I will bring in some questions from those who are participating. You can write questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I may not get to every question, or I may summarize some of them, but that's how you can submit a question. So I want to now introduce our panelists. We have with us Dr. Alan Levinson, Director of the Schusterman Center for Judaic Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and he holds the Josie Chair in Judaic History. We also have joining us Dr. Sharon Betzworth, Professor of Religion and Director of the Wimberley School of Religion here at Oklahoma City University, and also Dr. Brandon Ketzier, Associate Professor of English here at Oklahoma City University. So welcome, and I'll invite Dr. Levinson to go first, and then Dr. Betzworth and Dr. Ketzier.
Well, Lisa, I want to just publicly thank you for year after year holding this series, organizing it, doing it so collaboratively, and you just do a wonderful job every year, including this one. So thank you, and it's a great honor just to ask Dr. Rosenfeld a question. He's pretty famous for leading the Indiana University Judaic Studies program, not just for a long time, but so superlatively. I think it's fair to say that that's the triple A team for the best universities in the nation. They all seem to go on to Berkeley or Harvard or Penn, and he knows I'm not exaggerating. So thank you. My question is I guess two parts, also from the European Jewish perspective, and they both have to do with assessing anti-Semitism. The first part of the question is, in the 19th and 20th centuries, I think you could say anti-Semitism, you knew it had become really dangerous when it had become, to use Harrison's distinction, political. But before the Holocaust, that was often when you could see it become part of a major party, and it was almost always a party of the right. And it seems to me today, one of the hard things to assess is anti-Semitism, which is obviously getting more pernicious, but doesn't seem necessarily to need a major party and can be found both on the extreme right and left. So I'd love to know what you think about that. And if I may, just the second part of that is, again, there was a time when social anti-Semitism, I think for most of the modern era, Jews accepted that it would be there, that most non-Jews didn't care for them very much, and they planned accordingly in their lives and careers. And that was not terribly surprising. But I think in the 21st century, we have a lot more philo-Semitic and philo-Judaic. I guess I would say speaking as a Jew, we have a lot more allies and people who are sympathetic. And I'm wondering how you think that affects just our overall assessment of where anti-Semitism is and its dangers. So,
right. Thanks, Professor Levinson. Everything you said is accurate for sure. To start with the second question first, thank goodness, yes, we are not altogether alone. We do have allies. We want to multiply their numbers, that's true, but there are people who look on and detest anti-Semitism and are willing to say as much and join us in different ways in safeguarding against it and other kinds of hatreds as well. That's certainly all to the good. You're also right when you say that anti-Semitism became embedded in the political platforms of certain parties. If you think about even before Hitler, in Vienna, for instance, in parts of French history, German history, and the like, we're not seeing that so much. What we're seeing, and this is what you were getting at, we don't have a good name for it quite yet, but we're finding ourselves in a kind of anti-Semitic environment in which you have a kind of Alltags antisemitismus, an ordinary anti-Semitism. Swastikas proliferating, let's say, sometimes as pranks, but sometimes as vicious statements. Synagogues and Jews being attacked by this one and that one, not in an organized way, but just because people's passions, unrestrained, seem to enable them to feel free to go against Jews. That's a bad situation, for sure, because it's sort of in the air now. When we have a situation like that, first of all, we have to acknowledge it and then do whatever we can to help open other people's eyes to it and find ways to guard against it. Dr. Wolf was telling me a bit earlier about something she's encountered with some of her own students. They would visit the two local synagogues in your town, often for the first time, being inside a Jewish house of worship and meeting Jews, and coming back aghast that there was security in front of the synagogues because they can go to church on Sundays without passing through security. But I don't think there is a synagogue, Jewish school, Jewish community center, Jewish federation building in America, let alone in Europe these days, without guards. And that's indicative of the time we're living in. And if guards are needed, it's good they're there, but it's an alarm signal that we have to hear loudly and take seriously.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenfeld.
You're welcome. Yes.
I was when I was every time I go to Europe, especially, you go to a synagogue there, to go in is an ordeal, and it's an intimidating one too, because outside are people who are really quite heavily armed.
Right.
So.
Good. Are there other questions?
Dr. Betzworth, would you like to share a question next?
Sure. So next week, some of my students in world religions classes will be watching a film called Theologians Under Hitler, which describes the actions of three prominent Christian theologians in Germany during the Third Reich and their support of the Nazi agenda, and the complicity of much of the Christian church through the Nazi era. I'm wondering what steps have you noted that branches of Christianity have taken since the Nazi era to rectify the church's complicity in the Holocaust and Nazi anti-Semitism, and what further steps should be taken?
Yes, thanks for that question. As you know, because you study these things, we once had a generation of scholars, including Roy and Alice Eckhart, Paul Van Buren, John Polakowski, and others who devoted a great deal of attention to studying church connections to Nazi thought and Nazi actions at the worst of times. They did really good work, and some of that work continues today. The Catholic Church in 1965 passed a major statement called Nostra Aetate, in which they took a hard look at church catechisms, to some degree, not enough, but to some degree, theology, and even raised the question of deicide, which has been right at the heart of so much trouble between the churches, Jews and Judaism. I don't think they quite resolved it, but nonetheless recognized there's work to be done. And some Protestant churches similarly have done so. I've had students in some of my classes who are Lutheran, and when they learn about Luther's tract for the first time in their lives, they're absolutely shocked, and I'm a bit shocked that they never learned it from their churches, which were in fact Lutheran churches. So what needs to be done? It's not easy to grapple with parts of one's past, which can be pretty brutal when you look at them honestly, and yet a failure to do that gets us nowhere. So the more that churches can examine their teachings, their preachings, the more that Christians and Jews can come to know one another and find their way to one another, first of all as human beings, but find their way to one another as dedicated and devoted Christians and Jews who want to together make for a better world. One can only be all for that. Interfaith relations have been going on for some time, with more success, a little less success. They deserve to continue. These days, they're often triangular, involving Muslims and Islam as well. Also a good thing if one can find a way to do it. So the more people can talk with one another, meet one another with goodwill, honesty and candor, and a dedication to living up to the best ideals of their religions while acknowledging some of the sins of their religions, the better.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Ketzier, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for being here. It's great to get to speak with you and hear you talk. My question comes out of my reading recently in the biography, The Diary of Herman Kruk, who was the librarian of the Vilna Ghetto, appointed, first he served in that capacity and then was appointed to remain there by the Nazis. And the reason I think this is so interesting is because it had never occurred to me, I suppose, that while the Nazis are eliminating Jews and often destroying parts of Jewish life, Jewish artifacts, synagogues, etc., they were also apparently involved in this campaign to preserve some elements, some Jewish artifacts for use in a museum they intended to build to Judaism once they had annihilated the Jews, right?
Yes.
And it occurs to me that this happens again and again in these totalitarian anti-Semitic regimes. We see the same thing, for example, in the Soviet Union with the seizure of the library of Chabad Lubavitch in Soviet times. And we see this also in Iraq with currently the attempt to claim that Jewish antiquities that were left in Iraq in the 70s still belong to the state of Iraq. And I'm curious as to what you make of that dissonance, the idea that we want all Jews gone or all Jews in our territory gone, but we're going to retain some artifacts of Judaism.
Right. A few books have been written on the subject, and if you drop me an email afterwards, I'll be glad to send you some references to these sources. Not an easy question to answer, to be honest, because one thing flies in the face of the other thing. On the one hand, great roundups, persecution, and murder of Jews. It goes beyond mere theft, though. There was a great deal of robbery, we know that. But Jews are known as the people of the book. And I can't help but wonder if among the assailants of the Jews, there was not some lingering curiosity about Jewish literacy. Take literacy away from the Jews, you've got nothing left, because Jews are nothing if not a people engaged with the written word. Well, you can see what's behind me here, and in your house as well, and so on and so on. Jews are not the only people with a lot of books, but we can't live without our books, most especially our holy books. And I spend every Shabbat reading one of them. I suspect you do as well. And I imagine there was just this curiosity about this despised people who nonetheless have been able to hang on over long periods of time despite no end of adversity, because of what? I think because it was recognized they're people of the book. Now, can I prove that to you? No, but I think it's more than just an idle surmise. I think it bears some thought. And again, if you write me, I'll be glad to send you some references.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Well, we'll move on to some other questions, though my curiosity is piqued by that conversation. And thank you. I also wanted to thank Dr. Ketzier because he is the one who brought you to our attention and suggested you as our lecturer this year. So while he's there in front of everyone, I wanted to mention that. And I also wanted to mention that today's lecture period goes until the quarter before the hour, I'll say, to be inclusive of all time zones here, which is our usual class session in the afternoon. So we'll take questions until about that time and then consider going on a bit more depending. So let me give you, and my apologize to those who, if I don't specifically read your question, my apology. I'm trying to kind of summarize things and also not to repeat things that maybe were addressed yesterday, and that video will be available later. You'll receive an email with a link to the video. But the first thing I wanted to raise was a question regarding your historical overview, and this person reflected that it focused on Western Christianity and wondered how different or similar the situation was regarding anti-Semitism in the Eastern Christian world.
Right. Before attempting to answer, Alan Levinson put in the chat the title of Alon Confino's book, A World Without Jews, which certainly deals with the issue of Jews and books and the destruction of Jewish books. That's one of the titles I would pass on. What can I say about the life of Jews in within the realm of Eastern Christianity? I'm sorry to say not a whole lot because I've not studied it much. There are people who are studying Jewish life in those lands. There's a very good scholar at Stanford, Aaron Rodrigue, for instance, who is one of those people, and some others as well. But I confess it falls outside of my competency to answer it very well.
Fair enough. I had a couple of questions about what the Anglophone world or even the rest of the world knew about the militant anti-Semitic plot of the German military around 1919, 1920. What was the early history of warning about the Nazis' plans for the Holocaust?
Well, that early, nothing much doing because Hitler doesn't begin to take power until 1933. So we can't really speak to the early period. Germany went through a tough time. The Weimar era was a reasonably good time. The Weimar Constitution similarly, but one of the first things that Hitler and his party did upon assuming power, within 2 months of assuming power, is pass something called the Enabling Act, which enabled them to set aside all of the laws in from the Weimar era and begin passing new racial laws. So from that point on, we have lots to say, but earlier on, no, we're not yet there.
All right. We had several questions asking about factors that are leading to contemporary anti-Semitism, both in the US and more globally. And this person noted this was a question coming from someone in Israel.
Right, and the question, Dr. Wolf?
The factors that are leading to contemporary anti-Semitism, both in the US, but also globally.
Yes. we're living in a very overheated time in the US and globally. Things are pulling apart rather than pulling together. And also, we're living with a great deal of tumult, in fact, politically, socially, ideologically, and the like. Today's anti-Semitism comes from a few different areas. From the right, Professor Levinson brought that up. Also from the left, in reply to a question that I received last time, yesterday, about the left, the dominant form of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hostility from the left takes the form of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, which goes well beyond normative criticism, let's say, of this Israeli leader or that Israeli policy, and goes to the heart of Israel's right to exist, period. So I'd go so far as to say that maybe the dominant form, or certainly one of the dominant forms of today's anti-Semitism, is directed at the Jewish state, including thereby the idea of Jewish peoplehood as such. That's to say, individual Jews are okay, but when they collectively are seen as a people, let alone a people in its own nation state, with a powerful army willing to defend itself, a lot of people don't like that. So it flies in the face of certain universalist notions that just can't accommodate itself to Jewish particularism, most especially in the form of a nation state, but in other ways as well. And then there's the question of hostility within segments of Islam. Now we're talking about a world religion with a very large population in different countries. It's by no means monolithic. Nonetheless, it's impossible to understand today's anti-Semitism without looking at the quarters from which it comes. And within Europe, especially Western European countries, street level violence against Jews, time and again, not always, but time and again has been at the hands of radicalized Muslims, also at the hands of certain skinheads, neo-Nazis, and within Germany, others on the far right. So those are the one wants to look hard at the right, the left, and radicalized elements within Islam.
Good, thank you. In regard to, I think, some of the statistics that you were giving about the sort of rising ignorance about the Holocaust, there were several questions related to that. And why do you think that the knowledge of these events is becoming more and more misunderstood? And one person asked specifically, for instance, today's college students, why you think that ignorance level is rising?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I myself have been teaching courses on the Holocaust for many, many years, and I certainly have my counterpart at other universities as well. I hope if it's such a course is not yet given at your university, it soon may be, it will certainly attract serious interest among serious students for sure. But what one can say is that either it's not taught or it's taught poorly at the school level, and kids growing up may learn a little bit about Anne Frank, or they may see a movie, often a feel-good movie rather than a feel-bad movie about it. It's a horrible history to confront, but short of confronting it, we just remain ignorant. That's one thing. In addition, a lot of people, I think, have grown weary of the Jews and their sorrows. They just don't want to hear anymore about Jewish suffering. And there's almost, I hate to say it, but it's true, a kind of competitive bid for understanding other people's sufferings. Other people's have been suffering, and by no means should their histories or even present-day circumstances be overlooked, but the one shouldn't cancel out the other. And it's incumbent upon us, I think, to just live in the real world as best we can with all of the challenges that come, knowing what we need to know. And if we don't know it, we're going to not be in good shape.
Thank you. We have a question that's related to some of what you talked about yesterday, but I think perhaps you might have some more to say about it as well. Do you think that there is something unique about how anti-Semitism functions online? Is this a continuation of the same old, the history that you narrated, using new tools of the age, or is this something different, a new chapter of globalized hatred?
Right. A great deal of life, unfortunately, takes place online. So people, often lonely people, find that they're no longer alone. They find a community online, a circle to which they attach themselves, at times passionately, ideologically. And some of the more radical websites, I mentioned a couple of them yesterday, just keep feeding notions to which people attach themselves, that America is in the process of undergoing a de-Christianization, for instance. They implicate Jews in that America is losing its origins as a predominantly white country, and Jews who are helping, so it's claimed, to bring in immigrants, people of color, are at fault for that as well. There's a lot of Holocaust denial online. It can be very fervent at times. There is a great deal of anti-Israel passion online as well. So some of this is continuous with anti-Semitisms of the past. Some of it heightens these past anti-Semitisms in ways that you wouldn't ordinarily in public. You can be anonymous online and get away with saying things that would be disgraceful to say, I hope still disgraceful to say in public, but then people get offline and some of them feel stimulated to go ahead and do some pretty bad things. So we should not overlook what's online. Too much of life is virtual these days, and a great many people congregate online, talk terrible things to one another online, and encourage them to go out and act, as I pointed out in my talk yesterday.
Right. I was thinking of some of the things you said yesterday also about when we write something online, we're publishing, and just anyone can do that, and it doesn't need to be factual. And so
Right.
Again, I'll mention that the recording of that lecture will be available later this week or next week sometime soon, and we'll send that email to everyone who registered. Another question that I received is, would you speak about the ambivalence of political anti-Semites needing Jews as scapegoats for problems they cannot solve?
We're living in an awfully challenging time. There's no doubt about it. On just so many fronts, the health front, obviously, but also now the economy is not good and many people are out of jobs and suffering. There's a great deal of social tension. The politics in America is in pretty bad shape. We have a president now who's calling for unity. I can only hope that he will have a lot of allies who will help bring about some kind of unity, but we're certainly not unified right now. So there's just a lot of tension, a lot of anger, a lot of alienation, people feeling disenfranchised, people feeling let down. And who's to blame for all of that? Well, no one in particular is to blame for all of that. Blame can be apportioned all over the place. but there is a simple-minded favorite among favored scapegoats, and that's the Jews. So there are some people, I can't tell you how many, too many, but I can't quantify it, who once again point the finger at Jews as being responsible for mass suffering of various kinds.
Thanks. We're coming up on our end point, so I want to mention that, but I also received one question asking to get a copy of the list that Dr. Katsir had asked you for, or the books that you offered him. So maybe tomorrow you can provide that in the chat for us, or you can.
I'll send it to Brandon Katsir and also to you, and you can make it available. Professor Levinson has just before named a couple of books that are well worth knowing as well. We don't lack for some good studies. That's a good thing. And the more we can share those studies as well. Dr. Wolf, if I may, you might want to call attention to this webinar series on anti-Semitism that my institute has been doing. We have many to date, 13 webinars on anti-Semitism. We have 8 more upcoming, and they feature some of the world's leading experts on various forms of anti-Semitism. One upcoming that I'll call in particular to your attention will feature Jan Grabowski. Jan Grabowski is right now in Poland, where he was just brought to trial and accused of defaming the Polish nation. There's been a big story in the New York Times yesterday and again today about it. Jan is a friend and colleague, and he's going to speak, I think, on March 6th or 7th. You have that information. And that's well worth sharing with people who want to keep up with the way in which anti-Semitism is manifesting itself these days. Hungary's leading scholar, András Kovács, will speak about anti-Semitism in post-communist Hungary. We have a very good scholar who will be speaking about developments in France, and on and on.
That's very helpful, thank you. And we will work on making sure to get the information out about that, though I assume that people could search for the Judaic Studies program at Indiana University and probably find it that way as well.
Or even better, search for the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at Indiana University. The website lists all that. I think I sent it to you, but I can send it again.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for mentioning the situation in Poland. Someone had specifically asked about that among these many questions here. So I see that we are right at time, so I just want to wrap up here, and we can go a few more minutes if you are willing, for those who would like to, but I do like to respect the time guidelines that we originally agreed to. And I want to give some words of thanks to Dr. Paul Gebb and to Skye Toland from our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning for assisting with the webinar today, and to Sarah Kelly, who managed many hundreds of RSVP emails. We're so thrilled with the turnout for the webinars this week. We're so glad that you could join us, even though we're having an ice storm in Oklahoma City, and in ordinary times, I don't think you would have made it to the airport. So we're glad that it worked out this way. So thank you very much. And if you need to sign off, that's fine. And others of us who want to stay for maybe 5 more minutes and go through a few more questions, we'll do that. Is that okay, Dr. Rosenfeld?
Yes, I'm game by all means.
Okay, if you're game then. One question here, I found this very interesting about the contemporary situation, the current situation on the governments of Spain and Portugal extending citizenship to those descendants of the persecuted in the diaspora as a form of reparation, but also perhaps the irony of using it as a tool for economic revival and investment into the economies of those countries.
Yes, both of those things are true. It is the case that the governments in Spain and Portugal relatively recently have let it be known that descendants of Sephardic Jews who originated in those countries and then left under duress a long time ago are invited back. And what's behind that thinking, of course, I can't say for sure. I don't want to belittle it. There may be just a lot of goodwill, but there are also economic factors involved for sure.
I want to open it back up to Dr. Betzworth, Dr. Ketzier, Dr. Levinson, if any of you would like to ask another question.
Sure, I can ask another question. I'm wondering, this is kind of perhaps a bit of a personal question, but my wife and I are English professors. We noticed that that you began by studying William Blake, and so I'm not going to ask you about Blake, but I am a little curious as to I suppose, you know, we looked at your translation of a particularly harrowing account, I think, in which 20 youth were killed, children were killed in the Holocaust, and I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do you process this and live with this information day to day? What kind of toll does it take on you personally as a scholar to be so involved with this particular line of inquiry?
Right. You are right, Dr. Katsir, to say all my degrees are in English. And I wrote a doctoral dissertation on the connection between Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, far afield of everything I've been talking about today. And my first book, still done as a graduate student, was on William Blake. It's true. Poetry was always my first love. I also wrote and published some poetry once upon a time. And I was hired 100 years ago by Indiana University. Not quite 100 years, but I'm in my 52nd year on the faculty, as a specialist in American literature with a focus on American poetry. And I loved it. But then I read a couple of books by authors I had never heard of before. One, a writer named Elie Wiesel, now famous, but when his first book came out, no one had heard of him. And it grabbed me by the throat, I must say. And another book, well, I won't talk about other books, but I realized then and there that I had a special assignment, let's call it. We're all put on earth to do something, and it takes us a while to figure out what that is. In my case, my training in language and literature certainly enabled me to gain insights into Holocaust literature, although no one was then talking about a corpus of writings called Holocaust literature. There were a few of us at the time who wrote pioneer books on the subject and kind of established the field. Lawrence Langer was one, I was another. And I've just stayed with it ever since. It's not a happy subject, that's for sure, but it's an important one. And about a dozen years ago or so, I realized that anti-Semitism is not just a thing of the past. I was a friend of Elie Wiesel's for 40 years, and I saw him shortly before he died, and he was not happy about things, and I asked him what was what, and he said, I was wrong. I was simply wrong. I devoted my whole life in the post-war period to educating people about the Holocaust with the assumption that it would put an end to Jew hatred. And he came to the conclusion that it was all futility. I said, no, 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 no. It was hardly futile. You've reached many millions of people. I'm one of them, but there are many millions of more. But he felt it came to nothing. Well, he was not right about that, but it's important to carry on that work. So that's what I do. But on the other hand, life is to be enjoyed. And I don't want to say there's no pleasure in my life. The book that you mentioned, I translated with my wife. It's called The Murders at Bullenhuser Damm, and it involved Nazi medical experiments. So at times it gets very grim, but I'm a religiously observant Jew, and I find meaning in life through my religion and through my association with Jews all over the world and other good people all over the world. So I'm not forlorn, I'm not a pessimist by nature, but I realize I've taken on a heavy load, and Be'ezrat Hashem, I'll continue to carry it.
Thank you. Be'ezrat Hashem.
Yes.
Thank you. That was a beautiful story and powerful. Dr. Betzworth, do you want to ask one last thing or no? Okay, I think we'll end there. There are some other great questions, but I think this is time for today. And I thank you all again for being with us, and watch your email for a link that will contain the recordings of these. And I invite you to join us again tomorrow at 1 o'clock Central Time. And tomorrow we will begin with Psalms and Song from our university singers who have a beautiful and relevant gift of song to share with us at the beginning. And then we will hear the last lecture of the 2021 Neustadt lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And I'll see you tomorrow, I do hope.